Anyways, I'm excited to talk about this project. This is an initiative between Trakref and Darden related to compliance and sustainability. The project started about 5 months ago. We have chosen Darden for a couple of reasons, but basically we are all on a journey to better understand ESG reporting. These documents are now considered shareholder documents, and this is not in perfect alignment between Europe and the US. But the challenge for US companies that have European operations is to really understand what their European counterparts are doing, and how that reporting and record keeping will impact their own initiatives internally. In the interviews that I've had with European companies that are doing this, the bonuses are 30% in one case of bonuses were tied to ESG reporting. And so there's more to ESG than the environmental side. Of course, there's social and governance and social. There's a lot of key topics over there that will have an impact, like environmental justice and things like that. But in our space, what we're here to talk about today is how refrigerants are impacting Scope 1 emissions and ESG reporting in general. The goal with this project is to add some intelligence to the strategic planning process as it regards Scope 1 emissions. Oftentimes, companies will target a sector in Scope 1 emissions, and we'll talk about that, and I'll even answer questions if you have any. But they'll target, these targetings will be towards the fuel emissions for the building or for a fleet of vehicles. So they may go to higher efficiency vehicles. We've seen Amazon do that and Walmart. And that's great. It has terrific improvement on the bottom line. The problem that we've seen is as those numbers shrink, the size of the refrigerant impact grows significantly. And so this is now even a bigger trend to talk about refrigerant. And sometimes you'll hear it referred to as fugitive emissions. But the key is in understanding how to capture that data and what's expected for reporting. All right, Scope 1 emissions. This is a definition of Scope 1 emissions. It's very self-explanatory. Accidental or fugitive emissions related to refrigerant leaks, but also fire suppressant systems. Many fire suppressant systems are either CO2 based or they're a compound inside the fire suppression system, like a halon or some type of other refrigerant based propellant. Any questions there? Okay, I'm going to keep going. I'm going to do my best. Chase, as my co-panelist, you're going to help out.
Sounds good.
Okay. Very straightforward. Scope 2 emissions are purchased heat or energy, electricity. This is essentially keeping the lights on. Scope 3 are indirect emissions. This is your supply chain. This is the people that you buy things from. So your Scope 1 emissions would be somebody else's Scope 3 emissions if they buy a product or a service from you. And I should also note that the Trakref annually offsets our carbon impact by buying credits. So we're a zero emission company. So the goal here is to help the workforce meet stakeholders' growing needs for information. Essentially, we're in a transitional phase where operational information now has to be upgraded to investor grade data. And so we have some goals in helping achieve that information improvement. And in order to do that, we're participating with Darden to study how people at the decision-making level perceive ESG reporting. And we have an ultimate goal at the end, which I think will be fascinating. Now, we chose Darden. Its fundamental goal at Darden is to use the case method as its sole method for teaching. When you talk to the students from Darden, they all chose Darden because they knew they could work directly with companies. And rather than sit in a classroom, they would be out in the field, whether it was on a research project like this one or in an internship. Every one of the graduates from Darden, and I have to be careful not to call them kids because they're really not kids. Some of these people are in their 30s. But every one of the people from Darden has a job well before graduation. As a matter of fact, the people that are finishing our project are going on to Boston Consulting Group and Microsoft at the end of the project. Chase, you want to add anything to that?
No, I just think what we're trying to accomplish works, like you said, perfect in the case method because with the case method, excuse me, because we are creating a case and a study on sustainability, and it's great to get input from leaders across the marketplace. So
it is, and it's key to us understanding how to pivot to support that. It's a lot of information flowing back and forth. So we're about 5 months into the project. I would say we're 3, almost 4 heavy months into it. And I think we're really just starting to brush off the dust from understanding what we can try to accomplish with this study. All right. We hear a lot about the road to net zero, and whether you're on the road to net zero or just the road to net improvements, you have to include refrigerants in the journey. There's no way to ignore them. One of the things that shouldn't surprise anybody here is that many companies, even companies like Deloitte, this is pulled directly from a Deloitte audit in 2014, many companies struggle to understand their emission numbers. And as a result, they tend to underreport and overlook them. In the case that is referenced here, I won't share the name of the company that Deloitte was doing the audit for. It was more than one company, by the way. It was a group of companies, and the emission numbers are underestimated by, we know one of them well, but underestimated by between 5 and 15x actual numbers. It's a significant underreporting. But Deloitte struggled, and at the time, the thinking process was that US government emissions are reported as approximately 1%, and Deloitte didn't understand the nature of that 1%. The only emissions the United States reports on our carbon balance sheet as a country are emissions at chemical plants that produce HFC refrigerants. So if we import refrigerants from another country like China, Mexico, or India, the refrigerants make it to the United States. They're vented through normal fugitive transactions like leak repairs or handling losses. Those losses are not reported on the US's balance sheet. In the United States, we vent about 600 million pounds of refrigerant a year. That number is up from 450 million pounds roughly 10 years ago. And that is approximately 3 times greater than all the carbon emissions from passenger air travel. So it's a big number. So 3% doesn't cover it. This is pulled directly from a ESG report. And you'll notice that scope 1 emissions in this case are isolated to R22 refrigerant, so HCFCs, HFCs, I apologize. So the company that was reporting this was not reporting any emissions for materials like R22. They were only reporting when they had emissions of HCFCs, which they considered the next generation refrigerant. You'll see that there was growth in the fugitive emissions category. And I could spend a lot of time. I'm happy to answer any questions on this. I'm not singling out Kroger. Actually, Kroger does a very nice job of reporting their emissions. There's no shame in their emission number. As a matter of fact, I chose them because they do such a nice job at reporting their refrigerant emissions. And you can see the 10% growth in emissions. And they largely attribute that, though, if you read the narrative, to the conversion from R22 to HFC refrigerants. A couple of big takeaways. And Kroger's aware of it, so it's not like we're undermining them. They're not a client, by the way. The first thing is they don't report R22 emissions because they're HCFCs. So that's up to their shareholders if that's acceptable. Another thing they're not reporting is anything under 50 pounds. And the last thing that they're not reporting are comfort cooling equipment. So they're primarily reporting refrigeration equipment 50 pounds and over that is only charged with HFCs. So I can tell you that that's in the process of changing at Kroger and at a lot of other companies as well. And so we expect to see these numbers grow considerably. Two other categories that often get overlooked. One is refrigerant loss from transport vehicles, like fleet vehicles. And another one is in the shipping or transport, the cold chain, where it could have been a cargo ship or scope 1 emissions related to a cargo ship that was subleased to another party, could be through a different type of vendor. Scope 3 emissions is where that will eventually get captured. But at this point, it's a struggle for these companies to report as they transition from scope 1 to scope 3 by transferring assets outside their ecosystem. Anyone have any questions? I've gone through a lot of the slides, so we're cruising along here. Roya, anything? All right.
No, not yet.
Okay. Beyond grocery, we work a lot with grocery, so we're really familiar with the grocery footprint. But we work a lot also with other entities like hospitality, hospitals, municipalities, finance, data centers. Data centers and hospitals have an incredibly high density of cooling. It's different than grocery store cooling, but it's a very high density. Hospitality clients struggle with identifying infrastructural items inside their facilities. They may have outsourced the restaurant, or they may have different vendors on site who are running parts of the operation. And what happens time and again is identifying which of those aspects are scope 1 and scope 3 versus it also could be scope 2 and scope 3 as well, purchased energy. And it really depends on the meter. But the significant takeaway here is this comes from a really large high-tech company. And if you look at the scope 1 emissions, which are PFCs, which is another term for HFCs. So HFCs and PFCs are essentially the same thing. Perfluorinated compounds is a higher level umbrella term. You'll see that they've grown from 2016 to 2020. They've increased from 0.47 to 0.96. And that's really significant, the fact that there's high growth. And when you normalize emissions, we still have a significant impact from fugitive emissions. Of course, scope 2 emissions, electricity purchases, those are really easy to track. You've got an invoice. There are lots of companies out there that help with this. You can even do sub-metering or micrometering. But the challenge with refrigerants is it's all material transactions. It has to be extracted from invoices in many cases. Trakref, for anybody who's using Trakref that's on the call, you know that we'll help track that material. But more important than tracking the material is being able to identify what has to be reported out of that material transaction and what does not have to be reported. A lot of that will come down to how you set up your policy for reporting.
Yeah, and Ted, to comment on this, I think kind of a failure in the way that we report GHG emissions is we're failing because we require customers to present the 1 million metric tons, right? What I like about this is they normalize that reporting. So if you double your store count over 4 years and your metric tons only go up by 50%, once you apply that normalization. So I'd rather see a term like, tons of CO2 per location or per square foot. That's where that normalization comes in play, because if you're just reporting on tons of CO2, you'll actually be punished as a growing company as it takes additional electricity and refrigerants to keep those new stores and locations running. So that normalization factor that this customer created themselves, I think is key in the marketplace moving forward.
This brings up a really, interesting conversation I had this morning. My phone kept ringing and I answered the call really early, and it was a bank in Dubai, and they were transitioning to asking their clients for ESG reports when filing or requesting a loan, or even expanding access to money. So I would say they're about 3 months in, and they were asking me all kinds of questions about growth. They are, I don't know what will happen with this, but this is what they took away. They are going to use countrywide GDP growth to layer over, so financially layer over growth or shrinkage in normalized numbers. I forgot to tell you that earlier. I think it's very interesting. But let's say your company's growing by 30%, your emissions are growing by 20.
That's a win.
That's a win, exactly. So we had this conversation, and so you're right, that conversation is not being just had by us, but lots of other people outside of here as well. So I think that's what they'll be looking for. All right. So, and refrigerants are special. The reason this bank called me is we had done a small project with them a few years ago. This is a very high GWP, broadly used. This material is everywhere, and it's not easily aligned or readily aligned to compliance regulation. So EPA, a lot of people will say, well, I'm following the EPA's guidance and regulations. Well, that might have nothing to do with shareholder expectations. So for instance, we've seen clients who have 75 or 80,000 assets reporting their emissions from the assets that are impacted by EPA, and the assets impacted by EPA are roughly 4,000 or 5,000. So they're only reporting about 7 to 10% of total asset emissions. Does that make sense? So whether they're underreporting or not is up to the narrative that they share. Now, if you report that, and you have to be careful with this, because if the SEC does mandate scope 1 emissions reporting, which we believe they will at the end of February, and that's not just based on some guessing, it's based on transactional history that the SEC has been undergoing for about a year. So the SEC finished their comment period in July. They allowed companies to come in and talk to them. They interviewed a handful of companies in September and October. We expected them to require scope 1 emissions by the end of December, and they didn't. But they did indicate that they would have some type of guidance on scope 1 and 2 emissions by the end of February. So when it's required and it is a shareholder record, then there'll be audits related to that. And the audits will often look at the reporting framework. So there's a handful of reporting frameworks: GRI, CDP, SASB. I know that's a lot of acronyms. Anyone wants to know what they mean, type a note in, we'll respond. And as a participant in that group, we also see some private market companies like Persephone and Microsoft and others that are going to disclose information. So the auditors will look at the disclosed information, and then they'll look at the peers in their industry and determine whether the deviation from the peer results is high or low. If it's high, then they'll do a deeper audit. If it's low, they'll just pass it along, most likely. But this will likely evolve dramatically as ESG reporting begins to fulfill the same commitment level as financial reporting, because that's the track we're on. Now, it's going to be reported in two ways. Anybody on this call today who's responsible for refrigerant management or HVACR systems, right now, your finance team, your CFO should be asking you for the material impact of any scope 1, any emissions related to climate actions. And you have a big one to tell them about. That if you're only operating in 49 states or 48 states, excuse me, excluding Washington and California, which I'll get to, the other 48 states have to report the following thing. The AIM Act will do something to hinder your access to some amount of material that may force a conversion to more advanced refrigeration systems or air conditioning systems, because we're on a 15-year phase down for HFCs. So that's what you should be telling them. You should say, look, I know that you need some information. Let me start with this. That is referred to as materiality, and that's a requirement. That's already an existing SEC requirement in the United States. Now, if you're operating in Washington State or California, those requirements and regulations there under ARB and state Washington's, I forget what they're referred to as, but it's Rule 1103. Those people who are reporting there will have to disclose that there is a more aggressive phase down to HFCs, and that now your systems will have to be replaced. When they have to be replaced, they will have to have a lower than a certain number GWP. So you won't just be able to go pick the most affordable climate control system on the market. You'll have to pick one that applies specifically to that market. So those are your materiality disclosures, and those are required today. Now, double materiality is where you not only report what the environment is doing to your operation. So for instance, if you're on the waterfront or if you're in a high fire zone, we're losing property because of fires. Or we're losing productivity or product because of fires, or we're losing occupancy because of fires. Now you have to report the double materiality, which are scope 1 emissions. And this is a really simplified explanation. And that will say, okay, scope 1 emissions are, as I mentioned earlier, fugitive emissions specifically for our purposes today. And those fugitive emissions have this high level of GWP or low level of GWP impact. So eventually scope 1 emissions will be required, but already double materiality is in the requirement phase for any European operation. And it's for any operation that has 250 or more employees in the EU. Does anyone have any questions about that? Chase?
Nope.
Wow, awful good. So I'm either doing a great job or everyone's asleep. All right. Look, our goal with Darden and why we're sharing this with you today is if you're participating, we definitely will share the survey with you. But we really want to understand the connection between, or how businesses perceive the connection between operational maturity and ESG reporting. At the end of this research study, anyone who participates will get free access to the information, and they'll also get a report. There are 4 levels of maturity here: reactive, efficient, predictive, and reliable. There'll be a matrix, and we're not selling the matrix. We're using this matrix as a better way for the marketplace to understand how operations and ESG reporting are linked, and what that linkage looks like, and how to improve that process. Because ultimately what we're really looking at here is a greenhouse gas accounting process. And it can be very confusing at first. And the finance world has a big jump on accountability. And we're going to have to come up really quickly in the HVACR space to be able to provide that. So if you're a service provider and you thought that, well, we just have to worry about California, Washington, and some changes at the federal level, not true any longer. This information is not only going to be more stringently audited, but it's going to be more acutely managed over time. All right, well, that's it. I appreciate everybody joining, and we'll be sharing the survey. I really appreciate if you take some time to fill out the survey. The study is going to take about 3 months. We're few weeks in. Chase, want to give anybody an update on, or give everyone an update on the survey?
Yeah, we put together a project plan. We have about 200 surveys sent out, and then some personal interviews with the 3 Darden students who are focused on this specifically. It only takes 6 minutes to complete. It is completely anonymous, so would really appreciate any insight that you can provide, coming from your individual organizations to give them and us guidance on where ESG and sustainability fits within corporate America and where we think it's going.
Good, thank you. Anything else, Chase? We're kind of a little bit ahead of schedule. Happy to give everybody back 15 minutes of their day, but anything else you want to add?
Yeah, I just think that the game changer we're going to see, and we have seen through conversations, is when a CFO is signing off on a greenhouse gas report, it's no longer going to be good enough to use a prescriptive 1 or 2% is my estimated amount, just because that's not how finance and accounting individuals work. So, it's going to be a long path to get it down to where it can be auditable to the pound. But what we're trying to do is set everyone up for success to at least see what that journey looks like long term. Because again, once the CFO is signing off on the report, or the CEO, that data is going to have logic behind it, and there's going to have to be some type of journey to get more and more auditable in the future.
Yeah, and I will add something that happened last week. We had a client, they're a good sized client, they're not huge. They're not somebody that has ever called us to ask us about compliance or sustainability. We've never had a phone call from them. And about a week ago, Monday, I took my first phone call, and the question was, we have to report our ESG. We have to report to our ESG team our refrigerant emission numbers. And at the beginning of the week on Monday, we only had about 8 or 10% of their numbers, and we've been working with them for 5 years, because they don't report comfort cooling. They didn't report anything under 50 pounds. They didn't report warehouses. There were a handful of disqualifiers that had limited their reportability down to this much lower number. And the CEO, indirectly through the CFO, had the entire team drop everything they were doing for an entire week. And in 1 week, I've never seen this group of people spend this much time on a report. And at the end of the week, Friday night, the CEO hosted a meeting with the entire team across every state that they worked in. And it was late on a Friday. And he demanded that they have their emission numbers, because his new bonus structure was tied to the ESG success in the future. So the numbers had to be in there so that he has something to measure year over year against. And I found it fascinating because, number one, this is not a really large grocer. They're not insignificant. They have 1,000 employees, so that's a decent sized company anywhere. But the fact that they have never had this discussion, and then in 5 days undertook this entire process, brought a deeper awareness across the entire operation. And it really changed our relationship with them, because, groups of people that had never interacted with the data had always thought it was a better roadmap to keep this suppressed. Underestimate, don't overestimate, don't put yourself out there, don't expose yourself. That had always been the DNA of the decision making. And all of a sudden it was, let's put everything on the table. Let's get it on a whiteboard. I want to see evolutions of numbers from Monday to Friday. And it was no longer, let's contain this, but instead let's unpack it. Let's let the whole company see how refrigerant emissions impact our scope 1 emissions. And by the way, their scope 1 emissions turned out to be 50%. It's a grocer, so it's not too surprising. The scope 1 emissions from fugitive emissions were 50% of the the scope 2 emissions, their purchased electricity. So I found that really fascinating on Friday night. So I don't know if that helps anybody, but that was a really quick, short journey, from Monday to Friday, but very interesting. All right. Let's see. I've shared the survey. I appreciate it. We're going to be emailing everybody the survey, so thank you in advance for taking the 6 or 7 or 10 minutes it takes to fill that out. And we're always available if anyone has any questions. And if you're looking at this for the first time, you're not alone. If you're on the journey, you're not alone either. This is a path everyone's going to have to go down. So thank you. Oh, wait, I see one question. Chase, you did a bad job at your questions.
Yeah, he just, yeah, well, we can send a copy of the slides in PDF form. That's Francis asking for that.
Yeah.
And then another question, I guess he got stuck up on one of the questions on the survey, but Francis will send an updated link and make sure it's all open for you to go through.
All right, everybody. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ted.
All right. Well, everyone have a great day. Chase, thanks for backing me up. Roy, thanks for showing up.
Bye.
All right, bye.